On a cold night in October of 1859, abolitionist John H. Brown led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in what is now known today as West Virginia, with the intention of starting a slave liberation movement. He was so confident in his plan to liberate people from slavery that he had already prepared a draft of a constitution for a new slavery-free United States he hoped to create. He took the armory, but 7 people were killed and 10 more were injured in the process. Brown intended to arm slaves with weapons from the armory, but very few slaves were able to join the revolt. Within 36 hours, those of John Brown's men who had not fled were killed or captured by local militia and U.S. Marines, the latter led by Robert E. Lee. Brown was hastily tried for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, the murder of 5 men, and inciting a slave insurrection. He was found guilty of all counts and was hanged on December 2, 1859, the first person executed for treason in the history of the United States. Nearly a century later, Malcolm X, a civil rights revolutionary who had famously refused to organize with white people, would hail John Brown as the only white man for whom he would reconsider that decision. Frederick Douglass famously wrote, "Did John Brown draw his sword against slavery and thereby lose his life in vain? And to this I answer 10,000 times no. If John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery." If we look over the dates, places, and men for which this honor is claimed, we shall find that not Carolina but Virginia, not Fort Sumter but Harper's Ferry and the Arsenal, not Colonel Anderson but John Brown, began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The irrepressible conflict was one of words, votes, and compromises. When John Brown stretched forth his arm, the sky was cleared. The time for compromises was gone. The armed hosts of freedom stood face to face over the chasm of a broken union, and the clash of arms was at hand. John Brown was an early example of what we might now call an anti-racist. Now calm down, I'm not equating anti-racism to John Brown's level of violence. That's not always necessary. Not always. But what makes John Brown such a legendary figure was his willingness to confront the racism of his time by the greatest means he could achieve, and what he felt was necessary, and honestly, I'm inclined to agree with him. I may be a bit critical of his tactics, they certainly could use some work, but Brown's motivations were correct, as his method. Slavery wouldn't be abolished until the risk of slave rebellion, among other political drivers, became too great. The Haitian slave revolt, the first successful slave revolt in history, was part of what inspired this fear. Fun fact, after that war, France forced Haiti to pay them a debt that they're still paying off today, and that debt is now owned by Citibank. John Brown presents a challenge to today's anti-racist to look through what we've been taught to accept and see it for the injustice it is, and fight it. But in order to do that, we have to actually learn more about these topics. Racism and anti-racism, I mean. What are they really? What strange and shocking ways can we be perpetuating racism and racist ideas in our thought and logic processes, in our behavior, in our society? And what does it actually mean to be anti-racist? I think our answers may surprise you. Racism is a tricky beast, and sometimes even those of us who experience it the most, or those of us particularly on the left who like to think we understand racism enough and therefore don't need to unpack our own thoughts, don't fully understand it, and then perpetuate those behaviors. I will say personally this kind of talk is needed, having spent a lot of time with people on all sides of the political spectrum, from literal Nazi ex-coworkers to white anarchists to other black people in non-black POC. I can confirm that racism is everywhere from all of these groups. It's far more malicious and frequent coming from some over others, but it's everywhere nonetheless. And in the midst of a pandemic, concentration camps at the border, militarized police violence, and more, there hasn't been a more critical time for this work except maybe a year ago, but the second best time to plant a tree is always right now. So join us today while we look at author Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist, and remember that we're learning together. So if I get something wrong or if you have opinions or questions, put them in the comments and let's respectfully continue the dialogue so we can continue to learn together. Kendi spends the first chapter of his book, entitled Definitions, doing exactly what it says on the tin, defining what racism and anti-racism is, what it looks like versus its counterpart of racism and how it looks and plays out as well as later on, and almost more interestingly, who can actually be racist or not, because it's a more complex debate than we think. But as stated, we have to start with definitions first. Ibram Kendi defines racist as someone who is supporting a racist policy by their action or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. An anti-racist is someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy by their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Pretty simple definition, but also a bit of a broad one, and that's on purpose. It's been debated whether or not someone who experiences a certain level of oppression can actually be racist, quote unquote, because according to some, racism requires power over the other person. But one, that's not necessarily true. As Kendi says, if you're expressing a racist idea, action, or inaction, then you're racist, plain and simple. Anyone can express those ideas or commit those actions, even against their own race. Kendi goes into detail in this book about rooting out his own internalized racism against black people in the book, and it's a journey that is very reflective of my own. But the main takeaways from this quote are these. You don't have to be actively racist to be racist. Inaction in the face of racism is just as racist as the action itself. 2, there's no limit on who can be racist, and these labels are not permanent fixtures. If someone expresses a racist idea or action, they're racist. If they learn and then correct themselves with anti-racist actions and ideas, then they're anti-racist. Racism tends to be expressed as an idea in generalizations. Whenever someone expresses that a negative trait or a trait that makes them superior exists inherently among a racial group, they're expressing a racist idea. For example, all black people are angry, violent criminals, all people from the Middle East are terrorists, basically everything that people have been saying about Asian people since the pandemic started. These are examples of racism. The racist person sees behaviors or patterns and attributes them to failures of the race to perform or behave as a collective. The anti-racist understands behavior as individual and understands the iniquities between races not as a product of misbehavior of the members of that race, but as a result of racist power and policies or systemic racism, as we often use. Though that term can be a bit vague, especially to people who may not be familiar with it. Racist policy is a term that is a bit better to use because it's a bit more direct. To be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of these racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that. Individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representatives of entire races. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races. But in order to be anti-racist, we have to have an understanding of where race comes into play, how, and know that there's no such thing as a race-neutral policy or idea. They are either anti-racist, promoting equality and equity between racial groups, or racist, doing the opposite, creating iniquity between racial groups. We have to understand that race permeates everything. As Kendi says, the movement from racist to anti-racist is an ever-going struggle. There's no finish line, and anti-racism involves understanding and snubbing racism based on biology, ethnicity, body, culture, behavior, color, space, and class. Essentially, wherever racism expresses itself, racism permeates all of these things heavily. For example, when talking about bodily racism, it is explained how black bodies are seen as inherently more aggressive, dangerous, and unclean. Something I actually touched on in my video about Frantz Fanon. Bodily racism is about establishing inherent bodily differences between races that don't necessarily exist. The black body is not inherently bigger or stronger than the white body, even if that's what we've been taught. And it is in part that line of thinking that causes people like George Zimmerman to attack innocent black kids walking home from a store, or for cops to use excessive force exclusively against black people. The idea that the black body is stronger, more dangerous, tougher, or has a higher pain tolerance is part of what makes disgusting, murderous pigs like that piece of shit Derek Chauvin to kneel on an old man's neck for 8 minutes straight, as if any human body could survive that. It's the kind of racism that doctors use to excuse experimenting on black women during the creation of modern gynecology, and the experiments on black men that gave hundreds of them syphilis without them knowing. In America. This also connects to the chapter where he talks about the intersection of racism and gender stereotypes, where the idea that men are inherently more dangerous than women connects with racist ideas about the black body being inherently more dangerous, to paint black men or those seen as black masculine figures as hyper dangerous. As our favorite girl boss, Hillary Clinton, would put it, super predators. Though, let's be real, she's probably very familiar with the behavior of super predators, considering the company she likes to keep. Fun fact, this particular issue was one I faced a lot in middle school when I was at an all-white school. People often treated me like I was hyper dangerous compared to the white kids around me. One of my teachers actually claimed she was afraid of me, afraid of making me angry. I was 12 and she was a grown-ass woman. When I played too rough, I got in trouble. When other kids played too rough with me, it was ignored. When I got in trouble, my teachers would pull me aside and basically surround me while they reprimanded me. White kids around me barely got reprimanded at all. I was the kid they watched from the corner of their eye. If I, a non-neurotypical kid, became upset, it was immediately seen as a potential danger, to the point that I vividly remember the look of shock on one of my teachers' faces when, instead of reacting with anger to something, I started crying, as if she forgot that I was a 12-year-old child with a 12-year-old child's ability to regulate my emotions. Nearly every male kid I knew got into a fight at school at one point, and I never did, but I was still the suspicious one. I was the one the lunch ladies would accuse of stealing. I was the one teachers would yell at when they decided they wanted to yell. But when kids were racist to me, there was no yelling, if there was even really a reprimanding. There was instead an awkward silence as another child's racist comment was allowed to hang in the air. My tears and my emotions required an army of teachers to handle in case I popped off, but the child who put a price tag on my sister and called her his slave, the child who told me I couldn't sit with him and his friends at lunch because they didn't like my kind, the kids who isolated me, bullied me, and called me retarded when I behaved in non-neurotypical ways. Those kids didn't get that treatment because they weren't descended from super predators. They weren't super predators themselves. But to my teachers who grew up in that era and still carried that worldview, I was. To the people who crossed the street to avoid me, even now, I am. To the white woman who threatened to call the police on me if I didn't leave her property, i.e., a path more than 150 feet from her house, I was. Even though she had seen me there before, even though I had played with her kids, even though I lived in the same neighborhood and caught the bus to school in front of her house with her neighbor's son and her son. Those videos of white ladies being racist and freaking out are hilarious until you start to wonder how many young children like me were subjected to that behavior alone before a time period where we could record it with a phone and shame it. Because I didn't have that. I didn't tell anyone that happened to me for years. Not my parents, my sisters, or anyone. I didn't have a phone I could pull out and record. I didn't have someone I could tell. Somehow I just twisted it in my head to think it was my fault, and that somehow I'd done something wrong because I wanted to stop and look at frogs in a pond like literally any other 12-year-old. I used to have to move through the world doing my best to be the most affable, likable black person people had met because I was the only one they had met, and because I was afraid of them being afraid of me, because that fear gets you killed. I'd only ever stopped because I realized how sheerly fucking pointless it is, because you can be the kindest, most affable, sweet, funny, respectable, peacefully protesting angelic nigger on the plantation, you still just a nigger. Philando Castile worked at a school and was getting groceries with his partner and his 4-year-old child. He was polite and even-toned, and he was shot 5 times in the chest in front of his family. I'm forever traumatized by watching that video. Hearing a 4-year-old child beg her mother to stop crying while watching her boyfriend bleed out because at 4 years old, she knew her mother's tears would get them killed. That little girl said,
Mom, please stop saying cuss words and screaming because I don't want you to get shielded.
Okay, give me a kiss.
I could keep you safe.
It's okay, I got it, okay? I can't believe they just did that.
I wish this town was safer. I don't want it to be like this anymore.
that cop is walking free. If it was my choice, he wouldn't even be able to walk. Elijah McClain was a volunteer at an animal shelter. He was a musician. He was kind. Looking at pictures of him, there's no possible way this kid could be a threat to anyone. My 6-month-old cat does more damage to me than he could have. But bodily racism made the pigs who arrested him overestimate his size and strength and administer a dose of drugs that was nowhere near necessary for him. Drugs that they didn't even need to subdue him. These were his last words.
I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name is Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different, that's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. Why are you attacking me? To the police, he says, you are all phenomenal. You are beautiful, and I love you. Try to forgive me. Ow, that really hurt. You are all very, very strong. Teamwork makes the dream work. He starts to cry. Oh, I am so sorry. I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe.
Those cops walked free. Understanding these varying forms of racism is extremely important, as is understanding intersectionality, which I briefly touched on, sort of, in a previous video. Essentially, like how all of these different things, class, ethnicity, the body, etc., have their own ways that racism exists and plays out within them, intersectionality looks at how different forms of oppression connect. So if poor people are oppressed under capitalism, then intersectionality would point out how that oppression is compounded if you also experience racism as a person of color, and colorism as a darker-skinned or lighter-skinned person, and ableism if you happen to be those things and disabled, or homophobia and transphobia if you happen to be that as well. Basically, the more oppressed identities you inhabit, the deeper and more complex and often more difficult your experience can become. If we're addressing racism, we have to also address misogyny, homophobia, classism, ableism, transphobia, etc. If we don't, we will fail to actually combat any of those issues. If you don't understand the unique ways that a black woman experiences racism because of misogyny and vice versa, you cannot help that woman fight her oppression. Your view will be too restricted. You'll miss important factors if you don't understand how racism plays a part in the experience black and Latinx trans women face. You'll miss important factors if you don't understand how a lack of mental health care contributes to black men's experiences with police and in prison. You won't be able to solve the issues because you'll miss important factors, which is part of the reason why centering those voices most impacted is so important, because they understand what they need in order to fight their oppression. And most importantly, in my opinion, we have to understand how capitalism as an economic system created, perpetuates, and needs racism in order to exist. You cannot be anti-racist if you are not anti-capitalist. And if your anti-capitalism is missing anti-racism, you're lacking a vital tool. This book is not the end-all of becoming anti-racist. While the author does explain the intersections of race within the text, his analysis is only the beginning of this education. It's a basic rundown of the way that different people face oppression and the way that anyone can be racist to anyone. This is another controversial take, but as Kendi explains in the chapter titled White, racism against white people does exist. Not in the systemic sense, no, but systemic forms of racism are not the only ones, and he explains his own racist attitudes against white people at length. When on December 12, 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court stopped Florida's recount, I no longer saw the United States as a democracy. When Gore conceded the next day, when white Democrats stood aside and let Bush steal the presidency on the strength of destroyed black votes, I was shot back into the binary thinking of Sunday school, where I was taught about good and evil, God and the devil. As Bush's team transitioned that winter, I transitioned into hating white people. White people became devils to me, but I had to figure out how they came to be devils. I read The Making of a Devil, a chapter in Elijah Muhammad's Message to the Black Man in America, written in 1965. Muhammad led the unorthodox nation of Islam, NOI, from 1934 until his death in 1975. My first time reading this story, I sat there in my dorm room, sweating, mesmerized and scared. It felt like I had climbed up and consumed forbidden fruit. Every white person who'd mistreated me since my third grade teacher suddenly rushed back into my memory like a locomotive, blaring its horn in the middle of the forest. But my attention remained focused on all those whites who'd railroaded the election of 2000 in Florida. All those white policemen intimidating voters, white poll officials turning away voters, white state officials purging voters, white lawyers and judges defending voter suppression, all those white politicians echoing Gore's call to, for the sake of unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, concede the election to Bush. White people showed me they did not actually care about national unity or democracy, only unity among and democracy for white people. I lay in my dorm room staring up at the ceiling, silently raging at the white people walking away into the wilderness to plan Bush's presidency. What's interesting about this particular racism, though, is that it doesn't necessarily come from a place of superiority, but it's basically a trauma response to living under white supremacy. It doesn't make it okay, but it does make it understandable. The quote we just displayed shows that. Abram talks about his own negative traumatic experiences flashing in his brain as he took in these racist ideas. Oftentimes, the way that we think about other people, whether it's a race, someone criminalized, or some other group, can come from a place of genuine trauma. We have to be careful not to let ourselves blame these things on those groups as a whole, instead of on those individuals who push or act on racist ideas or harm other people. Months before being assassinated, Malcolm X faced a fact many admirers of Malcolm X still refuse to face. Black people can be racist toward white people. The NOI's white devil idea is a classic example. Whenever someone classifies people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, whenever someone says there's something wrong with white people as a group, someone's articulating a racist idea. The only thing wrong with white people is when they embrace racist ideas and policies and then deny their ideas and policies are racist. This is not to ignore that white people have massacred and enslaved millions of indigenous and African peoples, colonized and impoverished millions of people of color around the globe as their nations grew rich, all while producing racist ideas that blame the victims. This is to say their history of pillaging is not a result of evil genes or cultures of white people. There's no such thing as white genes. We must separate the warlike, greedy, bigoted, and individualist cultures of modern empire and racial capitalism, more on that later, from the cultures of white people. They are not one and the same. As the resistance within white nations shows, resistance admittedly often tempered by racist ideas. To be anti-racist is to never mistake the global march of white racism for the global march of white people. To be anti-racist is to never mistake the anti-racist hate of white racism for the racist hate of white people. To be anti-racist is to never conflate the racist people with white people, knowing there are anti-racist whites and racist non-whites. To be anti-racist is to see ordinary white people as the frequent victimizers of people of color and the frequent victims of racist power. Donald Trump's economic policies are geared toward enriching white male power, but at the expense of most of his white male followers, along with the rest of us. We must discern the difference between racist power and white people. For decades, racist power contributed to stagnating wages, destroying unions, deregulating banks and corporations, and steering funding for schools into prison and military budgets, policies that have often drawn backlash from some white people. White economic inequality, for instance, soared to the point that the so-called 99%ers occupied Wall Street in 2011, and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders ran a popular presidential campaign against the billionaire class in 2016. But don't be confused. Black and brown people wanting their own secluded spaces separate from white people is not racism. This is covered in the part of the book called Space, which is about how racism plays into how we view spaces that are predominantly black or colored versus spaces that are predominantly white. Oftentimes, spaces made to exclude white people are not an expression of hatred against white people, but intended and function as a place where people of color can be safe from experiencing the racism they experience in white spaces. Spaces populated predominantly by people of color are also often seen as more dangerous than white spaces, namely neighborhoods and such. But I find that interesting because I'm inclined to ask whether a black woman is in more danger in her own neighborhood than she is when she's at a hospital being treated by doctors and experiencing medical racism, because both have the potential to become deadly. Black neighborhoods are seen as more dangerous, but most of the black people I know are afraid to walk through white neighborhoods alone because having the police called on you is just as traumatic and deadly as anything that can happen to you in your own neighborhood where you live. And in a place where you're seen as not belonging, anything could happen. Just as racist power racializes people, racist power racializes space. The ghetto, the inner city, the third world. A space is racialized when a racial group is known to either govern that space or make up a clear majority in that space. A black space, for instance, is either a space publicly run by black people or a space where black people stand in the majority. Policies of space racism justify resource inequity through creating a racial hierarchy of space, lifting up white spaces as heaven and black spaces as hell. So how do we confront racism? How do we put anti-racism into action? It's not enough for us to simply know how to recognize it. Confronting racism means organizing, committing to action, supporting victims, building up dual power and infrastructure separate from the racist system. And even though at times John Brown might have had a point, again, not necessarily the approach we want to go for today. If our fight is against racist power, racist policy, and racist systems, and if, as we have seen time and time again with our failure to enact police reform within typical means of the US government, which is incapable of ever providing us the change we need to save lives, then we must build up anti-racist power to combat it. Race exists within the capitalist system to create hierarchy, so our solutions in anti-racism should take a bit more of a non- or even anti-hierarchical approach. Not to be like an anarchist or anything. We must build up, along with our ability to fight social forms of racism, anti-racist power, anti-racist policy, and anti-racist systems. And those systems must operate in a way that grants communities self-determination and the tools necessary to sustain that. This also includes understanding the elements of racist power that we live under, being aware of how, when, and where it perpetuates itself and continues to survive or thrive, and empowering those most affected with the ability and resources to fight it. We must implement anti-racism in every aspect of our lives. Biology, ethnicity, body, culture, behavior, color, space, and class All of these things are actively racialized, and examining the way that different ethnic groups within racial ones are treated differently, the way that how we think about biology and the body, the way we judge other people's behavior and culture, their spaces, their class, and whether or not they deserve class solidarity or how class issues impact them, is all affected by someone's race. And we have to understand that fighting racism is vital, because at the end of the day, the end result of racism isn't someone having a bad day because of an uncomfortable social experience. Racism isn't a mild inconvenience I have when an old white dude follows me in a grocery store. The end result of racism is death. The perpetrators behind the 500 black babies dying each year in Birmingham because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities were no less overt than the white terrorists who killed 4 black girls at a Birmingham church in 1963. In the way investigators can figure out exactly who those church bombers were, investigators can find out exactly what policies caused 500 black babies to die each year, and exactly who put those policies in place. In the way people have learned to see racist abuse coming out of the mouths of individual racists, people can learn to see racial iniquities emerging from racist policies. All forms of racism are overt if our anti-racist eyes are open to seeing racist policy and racial inequity. I feel the need to express when I make these videos that I'm not an expert, I'm not the smartest person in the room, I'm just a regular person who read a book and then talked about it. If you're watching this video, I'm hoping that you, along with me, are making learning your goal here, and thus, we are learning these things together. My goal is to get you to read this book, or even get you to do a quick Google for maybe a little more information after this video, or watch another video by someone else that might get suggested, or maybe just think a little differently and walk away from this video bettered in some way. I felt the need to make this video at this time amid the racial violence against Asians that is spiking right now, and the police killings and state terror constantly being experienced by black and brown people today. I want to be able to contribute to anti-racist action by creating this and stressing my solidarity with Asian Americans during this time, and creating this resource, but I also want to stress, as anti-fascism continues to be a political movement, how important anti-racism is to that movement intrinsically, and how much it is the responsibility of anyone who claims to fight fascism and to be anti-fascist to understand that fighting racism is part of that, and that those that experience systemic racism are also experiencing fascism as a result. And therefore, your anti-fascist work should center those people. Your spaces should be safe for them, and not just inclusive, but also value their voices and be informed and led by them. America is an inherently fascist nation. Being anti-racist for real means acknowledging that and acting like it, as well as understanding how racism and fascism are aspects of capitalism that are required. To defeat racism and fascism, we must defeat capitalism. If your anti-fascist movement doesn't understand that black and brown people are always exposed to American fascism and doesn't incorporate black revolutionary philosophy of the past and present, it is missing valuable components. Some of the first armed struggles against fascism in America were black and indigenous people fighting against slavery and against racist violence, against the stealing and destruction of native lands. But racism is one of the fastest spreading and most fatal cancers humanity has ever known. It is hard to find a place where its cancer cells are not dividing and multiplying. There is nothing I can see in our world today, in our history, giving me more hope that one day anti-racists will win the fight, that one day the flag of anti-racism will fly over a world of equity. What gives me hope is a simple truism. Once we lose hope, we are guaranteed to lose. But if we ignore the odds and fight to create an anti-racist world, then we give humanity a chance to one day survive, a chance to live in communion, a chance to be forever free.